Global Digest think tank group. We cover the global issues. So before we start our discussion, why don't you briefly introduce yourself to our audience? Please, Petra.
I'm working with UN ODC at the moment on a project to train children's officers in Kenya to identify and respond to violent extremism for the children they're working with. So I am a principal consultant now with Phronesis Consulting and Training, but I was previously the director of countering violent extremism with New South Wales Juvenile Justice. And I've worked in youth justice for over 15 years, primarily as a counsellor, but then also doing some work in management custodial services. And then I moved into specifically working with juveniles and young people around terrorism and violent extremism. And now I consult internationally for a range of organisations, still focused on children and young people in the space, but I also do a lot of work with governments around repatriation, so returnees, reintegration, and education really of different organisations on how they can respond to the risks of extremism and terrorism within their countries and organisations. Yeah, so I've worked with a range of international organisations, UN ODC, UNDP. I'm with UN IOM in Iraq at the moment as well on a project there. I've worked with the International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law in Malta, the Commonwealth Secretariat as well. So a range of different international organisations who provide policy, but also practitioner assistance and resources in the space, particularly with juveniles in a counterterrorism context.
You are in Kenya working for children particularly?
Yeah, working with the Directorate of Children's Services.
I see.
So, I mean, worldwide, there are quite a number of children and young people, if we accept that that's under the age of 18, when we say children, who are involved in various terrorist organisations or activities. We've seen a number of children and young people convicted in Australia of terrorism offences. We also saw a number of children and young people leave Australia and go to conflict zones in the Middle East. In Kenya, they have a large number of young people recruited to organisations like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and in places in Al-Shabaab is like affiliate, and so mostly prevalent in Somalia, but has also been quite active in the border regions of Kenya as well, and recently has done a great job of actively trying to recruit children and young people to their cause.
Because I don't know about that area, I'm not expert about that area. So, what kind of service you did provide to children?
Yeah, so internationally, it's accepted that children are victims in circumstances of violent extremism and terrorism, and most often that's reflective of the unique circumstances of children in terms of development, capacity, and also the agency that they might have. So for some children, they may be part of organisations because their parents are, so they may not have necessarily agency in that. For others, they've been recruited because of their particular vulnerabilities, developmental, as well as just being a young person means that you don't necessarily have as much critical thinking skills or the ability to think so far into the future about consequences. And so the acceptance internationally is that children are victims even in circumstances where they may play the role of perpetrator. And we've seen quite a few of those where children have been actively involved in various terrorist acts and attacks and definitely plans. And that spreads across the spectrum of violent extremism, so both religious and political extremist actions. Kenya is currently a peaceful country, but it hasn't always been. And I think the conditions for extremism don't necessarily extend to just whether your country is peaceful. There are a lot of socioeconomic drivers in Kenya as well, where there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of lack of opportunity for education and employment. There's also drivers revolving around various religions and the strength of religion and the conflict potentially between religions. And just the fact that young people are, we know, susceptible to a lot of the recruitment strategies of various terrorist organizations. They offer them a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, sometimes status. They get to be a bit of a hero. And so we know a lot of that can influence young people to become involved. And particularly where you have regions that are very close together with porous borders, what might occur in one country definitely has an impact on the other, especially in those border regions. So there's been a lot of work between the Kenyan forces and the Sudanese forces in terms of making sure that they are trying to decrease the ease at which children and young people can cross the border, and particularly into places like Mogadishu. But we certainly know that terrorism and violent extremism doesn't really accept borders. It certainly doesn't accept geographical ones. And so the border region is only one area that needs to be really considered. There are other significant regions in Kenya which experience high levels of radicalization simply because of greater macro kind of push factors that children are trying to escape.
Even though Kenya can be a peaceful country, but as you mentioned, the surrounding country are not peaceful country, it will always, Bora is not secure. Anybody can in and out. That's why Kenya also affected from the neighboring violence.
Absolutely. So the Directorate of Children's Services service the entire Kenya, and so it's really about saying children's officers are learning to identify and respond. So really looking at prevention and diversion as a way of ensuring that children and young people don't become susceptible or vulnerable to those kinds of things that might lead them to violent extremism or terrorist organizations. I mean, I don't always think that violence is where violent countries is where violent extremism comes from necessarily. I mean, Australia wouldn't be considered a particularly violent or unsettled country, and yet we have had, we've had terrorist attacks. We've had lots of Australians go to fight in different organizations overseas. So I think sometimes it's really difficult to contain an extremist ideology because it's no longer geographically located. And so, things like the internet and the ability of news and international news to spread messages and show, different conflicts around the world mean that kind of the whole world is now involved in different conflicts that occur. And we just don't know what message that sends to particularly children and young people who maybe are feeling disillusioned, maybe disconnected with their own communities, and feel like there might be some purpose or some value for them in traveling to another country, maybe that they don't really know, and participating in something that they're led to believe is a good cause or a worthy cause. So I think the way that terrorist organizations have used social media and the internet to recruit means that it's no longer confined to the geography of a country in which we might be seeing conflict. And we certainly saw that throughout the Middle East, and particularly in places like Syria and Iraq, where lots of people traveled to fight in conflict that wasn't necessarily from the country that they originated from. So it becomes quite tricky because we're not necessarily just dealing with what's occurring in Kenya for Kenyans. We're dealing with all of those international pressures and the social media that reaches well beyond countries' borders.
If I'm not wrong, I guess you are mainly dealing with counter-terrorism-related physical violence, terrorism violence related to children in Africa. I mean, that subject is the main, I guess, you are teaching how to.
Yeah, and recognizing that there are
issue. The other domestic issue is not just Africa. I think even developed country, if you can explain more detail, please.
Yeah. I'll try my best. It's a complicated question. I mean, I deal specifically in the risk of harm to children that emanates from violent extremism and terrorism. But I recognise that that is just one risk of harm to children, and that's children everywhere. You know, there are a variety of risk of harms that children are exposed to. You know, sexual violence, physical violence, emotional abuse, neglect. Not to mention, you know, just drivers that are more political around access to food and water and basic needs. So I recognise that the area that I'm in is a very small part of what makes up, you know, child safety and protecting children. But it's also a very important part for me, in the sense that, you know, children are vulnerable to this risk, and we do have to look at it and consider in particular contexts for particular children that this is one risk of harm to them. And the outcomes for children who are involved in terrorism are not great. So, you know, there are a number of children who die as a result of their engagement with violent extremist groups and terrorist groups. And there are a number who end up incarcerated for long periods of time because of it. So I think we have to place it in a context that it's just one thing that contributes to a risk of harm for children. But it is one thing that we also need to be mindful of, and particularly in areas where we know that there is high levels of activity, extremist activity and terrorist group activity, that it's something that we need to be mindful of when we're working with children in those spaces. So it's very difficult to say where exactly children might be exposed to this risk. We certainly can know that in some places we may need to do more work, but we also recognise that it has no border, in the sense that much like child sexual grooming online, you know, and even bullying online, we know that it can emanate from anywhere, and it can affect children anywhere. I mean, I think for me, you know, it's there are lots of things that might impact on children's safety, and you raise that violence is one of them. And violence can happen in a number of contexts, not just extremist groups. You know, there are children who are used as child soldiers, and you know, there are children who are used in child labour. So all of those things can contribute to you know, negative outcomes for children. I think for me, it's my focus and my area is around where extremist groups are exploiting children because of their vulnerabilities, recruiting them as a way of furthering an extremist cause. So some groups, you know, maybe more organised crime, in the sense that they are recruiting children, but their outcome is just economic benefit. They just want more money. And they're going to use children because they get free labour from them. And I understand that that's a huge risk, and I'm very grateful that there are other colleagues out there who work specifically in that area. You know, I think we all play a part. There's a multitude of stakeholders in child safety and child protection and upholding children's rights across the globe, and I just play a very small part of that in a very small area that exposes children to risk and harm. And I think for me, the reason that I do this work is because exposing children to extremist ideology, recruiting children to extremist groups and to terrorist organizations, places that child and young person at harm. Physical harm, emotional harm, psychological harm. So for me, it's important that wherever possible, we can prevent and divert children from becoming involved. And where they do become involved, we can manage that in a way that respects the fact that they are children. And so they are victims in that sense. And we can work to, in whatever form, rehabilitate children and reintegrate them back into communities and society, so that, you know, we're at least giving them an opportunity for a life that maybe was taken from them at a very early age by recruiters and extremist organizations.
I'm not sure Australia is a party of Convention on the Right of Children, because USA is not a member of CRC. So Australia is signed.
Australia is, yes. We haven't ratified, but yes, we're a member of the CRC, yes.
Probably Australia may be better improve on the right of children. I'm not sure.
We certainly have CRC charters as the basis of a lot of our legislation when it comes to children, and we have children's rights commissioners throughout Australia who monitor.
The one who sign is much aware than who doesn't sign the convention. You know, Australia did so.
Yeah, and it's great that we have that as a foundation for our our involvement with children and our treatment of children in different organisations and services, and the fact that we have placed commissioners as responsible for safeguarding that organisations uphold their responsibilities under the CRC. And I think internationally, the CRC definitely does a lot of work in supporting different countries to uphold their responsibilities under that as well. I do think that there are, obviously we could all do more. It doesn't matter whether we've agreed to a convention or not. It's our responsibility to do more than just what's required and actually do, better than that, I think, for our children. And part of it is that we understand the varying ways that children can be harmed, and the fact that as you said before, a lot of times they don't have choice in some things. People are making choices for them, adults, whether it's their parents or caregivers or teachers or guardians are making choices for them, and so ensuring that the choices that are made don't place those children at any more harm and any more risk. And that's a responsibility that we all have internationally to uphold our responsibilities to children, really.
Military government in Burma, they use children by recruiting underage boys for soldiers. That is a child soldier. So there are a lot of military government use child soldier. So how do you see such kind of violence?
Yeah, look, child soldiers is not really my area of expertise in terms of what's happening with them when we're able to return them from to communities and families. I would imagine that, I mean, one of the really helpful things with children is that they are reasonably resilient, and because they are still forming, the earlier that we can start to support them through the trauma and the experiences and the harm that has been caused, the more likely it is that they will actually be able to go on to live what we would think is healthy and happy lives. So I mean, I think there are lots of efforts to ensure that children never end up in that place in the first place. But when they do, it's about how do we actually retrieve them from certain situations? What does that look like? And then who and how are we responsible for dealing with the harms or assisting children to overcome some of the harms that have been done to them in those situations? I think, the first prevention is always better than cure, always. How is it that we work and engage with different governments and different organisations to ensure that children are just never used in those circumstances, that there is no place for children in war and in violence. But I guess, that's an issue that's been worked on now for many, many years. I'd like to think that we're making some progress, but it's still something that needs to be at the forefront of our minds. And I think, it is on international communities to leverage the influence that they have on various governments who may still be engaging in some of those behaviours. Education is also really important as well, around educating, individuals.
The Burmese military government, they have a lot of education from even some Burmese elite. Their children and their related, they study from very prestigious university, Oxford or Harvard, or even some military elite. They have education, but they did not, I don't know, they did not apply their education for the ruling in the country. The military behavior is very difficult,
Yeah, and I think sometimes it comes down to then trying to understand what's the motivation, what is their purpose, why are they doing that? And it does come down to international communities and organizations, leveraging what they can to really well condemn, firstly, any of those actions, but also then support change. And I think that's the important thing. If we're going to say you shouldn't do something, let's support people to do something else instead. And that's really, I think, important when we're starting to look at how do we actually withdraw children from these areas of conflict, whether they be through wars or through military service or through recruitment to terrorist organizations. What are the main steps in order to get children out? Who are the main players? Who are the stakeholders? I mean, there needs to be a bit of a plan around that. I mean, the international community is working to improve outcomes for children across the globe, but it's quite a long way, and we still have a long way to go, I think, in even developed countries like Australia. We still have tens of thousands of children removed from the care of their parents and placed in foster care, which we know doesn't have great outcomes for children. So I think we all need to be concerned and concern ourselves with what role each of us can play in protecting children. And it may be small roles or it may be large roles, but they all add up eventually.
But I'm not sure the violence may be different level and different kind of violence.
I think the impact on violence on children, it's significant no matter what the kind of violence is and no matter where it occurs. So, whether it's domestic or whether it's violence through exposure to war or violence through exposure to terrorism, I think the impact of violence on children is significant, and I think we should be working together to reduce the exposure that children have to violence just internationally and globally. Any violence and all violence, that would be the best outcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, John. It was very lovely to talk to you.
Nice to meet you. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too.